Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here with the second installment of the RG100 Tone Engineer. Today we are diving through a rig that I would have been ecstatic to have owned when I was a Bay Area tone-obsessed teenager. I present to you the solid-state thrash metal rig. Though my current interests predominantly lie in the more extreme and progressive sides of metal, I've very much cut my guitar playing teeth on thrash metal, the big four, Exodus, Testament, Creator. And it makes sense, as it was kind of a perfect bridge between the more classic bands that I was used to growing up around and the things that I would eventually become more interested in as the years went on. So given the choice of today's rig, I thought it would be a perfect opportunity to go back and revisit some of those classic riffs that I love to probably butcher around that time, playing incorrectly and loudly every day after school. Shouts out to my parents for enduring that crap. And I think what will be ultimately proven today is that the RG100 in particular, and a lot of Randall's amps throughout the years, have been totally sleeper rigs for the kind of genres that were really popular around its time. And of course, a lot of that style of metal took a nosedive in the 90s and old school death metal kind of reigned in terms of the heavy stuff. And this does that great. Of course, it does the Dimebag tones and the Kirk Windstein tones and all that. And I'd heard that growing up, but I always looked at this and thought, you know what? I bet this amplifier is way more capable than people give it credit for at reproducing a lot of these classic hard rock and heavy metal tones. I could hear this fundamental distortion texture under, Pantera's guitar tones that made me think there's more to this than that one trick. So as I would look at the newer versions of the RG amps and Musician's Friend and, Guitar Center catalogs, and obviously I would really like to try one of these. And as it turns out, I was correct. This thing does thrash metal fantastically, though a few players had, unbeknownst to me, already figured that out back in its heyday with bands like Anthrax and even more light bands like Def Leppard flirting with the Randall amps on and off over the years. So over a decade later, I get to finally put this rig through its paces and somewhat reproduce some of my favorite thrash tones while blending the inherent character of this amp. And I think my favorite part of this video is between the guitars and the pedals and everything I'm using, though the exact model I'm using here wasn't necessarily available between, say, 85 and 95, there were models out there that were equivalent. For instance, the Boss pedals, you could pretty much find those. But with this particular DD7, that wasn't available back then. But there was the DD2 and the DD3 using a similar digital path. Even if the frequency responses weren't quite identical, they still had pretty similar modes in terms of delay time and mix, and you could get it to sound pretty much the same. So what I think I really like about this is really representative of something that a high school kid with a job after school or a blue-collar worker could absolutely achieve. And though there was plenty of bands in the late 80s to mid-90s that utilized other budget-friendly options like, clean PV amps with Boss pedals stacked in front or the infamous Marshall valve state, I think this goes to show that this is a really viable rig, not only for thrash metal, but old school death metal as well. So with that, let's talk about why I think this is such a close one-to-one match for a lot of the rigs that real thrash metal bands were using at the time. First off, on the guitar front, I'm going to predominantly be playing my Pawn Shop Rescue Jackson RR3, bolt-on neck, Fender scale length. We've got the Floyd Rose licensed tremolo. I did replace the pickups with EMG Hertz. These are passive high output pickups. And the overall tonal signature of this is pure thrash, in my opinion. It has kind of a mid-scooped, grunty to the pickup attack, which I really like, whereas more of the Gibson scale length guitars kind of have a more mid-focus growl with it. I will be using my EMG 81 equipped Wild Audio Blood Eagle towards the end for some of the D standard stuff. Whatever you got, if it's something equivalent to this setup, could be Fender scale length, Gibson scale length, bolt-on set, whatever you got, it'll probably work just fine. Going in reverse here on my amplifier signal chain, I'll be using a single SM57 to mic up this speaker in particular, because we're not going for anything super fancy here. Once again, this is another kind of blue collar genre where multi-mic situations doesn't really fit the sonic aesthetic of what we're going for. Kind of just put it right up to the edge of the dust cap and speaker cone. You'll see some footage of where exactly I put it, but I won't change that position unlike some previous videos, though you can, of course, dial it in to your tastes. Now, as for what a lot of the thrash metal players at the time were using, it would have looked something similar to the overall signal chain that we're implementing today, except more than likely, unless you were a world-class band like Metallica, this would have Marshall across the front. Now, I think this is more of a byproduct of being a blend of more technical sounds and music with a lot of the sounds that carried over from the new wave of British heavy metal, where a lot of those bands were, implementing cranked plexis and some of the, at the time, newer 2203, 2204 circuits. And thrash metal is really taking a lot of those fundamental tones and just ravaging the shit out of it, right? For a lot of, especially the early Bay Area stuff, it didn't sound, as far as guitar tones go, that dissimilar from, an Iron Maiden or a Motorhead. That means for most of the big acts at the time, you were probably going to see some Marshall JCM 800 2203 or modified Super Lead sitting on top of some sort of angled 4x12 cabinet loaded with Celestion speakers. Well, with the cabinet in particular, this Randall cabinet is very much in the same vein of a Marshall angled 4x12. The dimensions aren't exact, but they're pretty close. And another aspect of this cab that helps for today's application is that it's actually loaded with 65-watt Celestion creambacks from the factory, which is different than a lot of the cabs that had the Randall Jaguar speakers. Now, they don't sound that different, but it is one more thing that helps get closer to, at its root, what is essentially a modified British tone. That output frequency response very much mimics those kind of greenback, creamback, T75 sounds that we heard with early thrash metal, and of course V30s that would come later down the road. So it's all in that same kind of soup of cabinet tones, and with that being one of the most critical and important things to a guitar sound, if we don't get this right, we're not getting anything else right. So this is crucial. For the amplifier head itself, then, I'm sure there's a lot of people writing this off as a fool's errand, thinking there's no way, you're going to replicate a 100-watt tube heads tone with something that exclusively uses transistors in its place. But the thing about thrash metal is that the amp head didn't matter all that much past a certain threshold. Yes, in apples to apples comparison, of course, Ride the Lightning sounds night and day different from Master of Puppets, but those two albums still sound like Metallica. And with a little EQ trickery and, some preamp help here and there, they probably could have sounded way more similar than they do. In essence, a thrash metal band using a Marshall head is still going to sound like that band if they use a Randall head. The reason that is because, especially with a lot of metal genres at that time, they weren't exactly going for what I would call character tones of any particular gear. They're not setting up those amps on the edge of breakup or, getting that perfect crunch that only that amp can do on those settings. They were ultimately using whatever they had on hand, whatever they could get a hold of that was popular at the time, as a platform to push as much distortion as possible, wherever that came from. Now, for a lot of this stuff, power amp distortion on a tube head doesn't really fit too well with some of these thrash tones. Depends on how you balance it with the preamp. But for a lot of that stuff, they were cranking the preamp gain on something like a JCM 800 and then still slamming the front end with something to help it out further. You can't plug in straight into a JCM 800 unmodified and sound like early Anthrax or Megadeth. It's not going to happen, which is why a lot of the bands were using pedals or preamplifiers to help it out and get the sounds they were. And that goes back to my philosophy, where if you're using all these outboard tools anyway, number one, you're probably not shooting for the core personality of whatever amp platform you're using. And two, you can certainly dial out those differences, push some frequencies in a different way, or adjust the gain here and there and get an end result that is pretty damn close to the original source tone. That's what we're going to be shooting for. So for a lot of this, you're going to see gain damn near max for the RG100 setting on the red channel. Sometimes I'll have it dialed back a little bit to let the bright cap do some work and, you know, accentuate the high end versus how much saturation I'm getting on the lows and mids, but you're going to see it there a lot. Master volume kind of stays around here, starts to sound a little weird near noon, and I'll be using some other tools in the loop that will affect the output levels. So this is kind of just using it for compensation. The real trick lies in the tone stack. No reverb for this, obviously, but bass, middle, treble, and presence is what kind of shapes my blank slate. Now, for a lot of these tones, I'm just using that exclusively. And for a vast majority of these sounds, you'll see I'm running presence, if not completely maxed out, well past 3 o'clock. And that helps with bringing in some of the hi-fi presence that you would normally get on a tube amplifier with its power amp control, since this is kind of more of a high cut wired backwards. And it helps with being able to use the treble more as kind of a high mids control and shapes kind of the vocal character of the amp rather than using it the way that you kind of would on a Marshall amp, even though the tone stack behaves very similarly to a Marshall, which is to say that, yes, you can scoop the shit out of these mids if you're just using this platform alone, but you'll have to compensate for that somewhere else or you'll be completely buried with something like the bass control being dialed down below noon, or treble even being dialed down below noon or cranked up to 7, 8 to bring in some high mids. So it kills me about a lot of people that are either hard stance on, oh, you always got to scoop the mids or never scoop the mids. It's like, well, it depends. You're not always getting the same mid output level. So you're just trying to achieve a balance that sounds right. And as you'll see for some of these later applications, we can scoop one mid frequency and boost another, go back and forth and get something that sounds balanced overall, but it's just different. For the pedal selection then, you're not going to see this pop up in every demo, so it just wasn't terribly necessary. But for some of these tones, it very much is. We have the Boss NS2 noise suppressor, nothing fancy, certainly far from the most capable noise gate on the market today, but it was available back then, and it's good enough for what we're doing. I'm not trying to clamp down on 100% of the noise here, just trying to make it tolerable. Again, we're not going for pristine studio tones here. A little bit of nastiness is kind of welcome in this situation. For our first pedal in the pre-amplifier signal chain, I chose the Proco Rat. This guy's been seeing quite a bit of mileage on the Tone Engineer here in the past couple of years because, one, tube screamers are boring, especially for this application, and they're a little too nice, a little too produced. That mid-hump and the symmetrical, almost grainy distortion does not fit with what we're doing today. You can get good sounds out of it, ran plenty of tube screamer style pedals up in front, and it works fine. But we're going for a little bit of nastiness, a little chewiness, a little rough around the edges kind of distortion character, and this helps tremendously, and it blends right in. Now, given the rough, hard clipping nature of this pedal, you can definitely crank distortion and just fuzz the hell out on this, but that is not what we're going for today. So I'm actually going to start with distortion basically minimized, crank the volume. We're now acting as close as a clean boost as this pedal can, and then filter will be used to dial in how much high end you want to slam the amplifier. Now, for some sounds, we want to put the filter well past noon to cut off a lot of the high end. This is kind of a high cut control when it's wired this way on the newer revisions. But for some sounds, depending on how the rest of the signal chain is aligned, we're actually going to let in more of that and let it be a little nastier than some of the mid-hump tube screamer sounds. Now, at this point, regardless of where you set filter, you're probably going to notice I don't have a whole lot of output volume. That's because distortion doesn't really start to kick in until you get just above the minimum point. And I wish like we could do something about this in the circuit and make it to where you don't have to do this particular move, but you will find that just barely past minimum into 1.5 is where this really starts to kick in. On this distortion setting with the gain maximized, this very well may be enough saturation for you, but you might also find that if you like that nasty, chewy texture, you can turn up distortion a little bit, turn down volume here, and you'll get an overall similar level coming out of the pedal that's hitting the amplifier, but just with a different texture. So be sure to play with that. That's kind of what I do. I dial these in kind of inversely, but similarly. And this can do an absolutely fantastic kill 'em all sound, as that's what they use. Some early Megadeth, just early thrash in general. It sounds like a 2203 about to explode. Speaking of almost clean boosts, the next pedal I chose is based off of one of Kerry King's favorite tricks, which is to boost the front end of his 2203s with an MXR 10-band EQ. Now, this is not the Silverface version with the quieter circuitry, so this one gets rumbly, rather noisy. You'll want that noise suppressor on for most of this if you're going to be, have any stop mutes or anything of that sort. But the overall EQ profile is a slight gain boost depending on how much you need, and a basic overall upside down smiley face. And the particular frequencies you're boosting does very much depend on what you're going after, but this is kind of the typical sound you would go for, with Kerry King boosting 500, 1K, and then they kind of fell off mostly symmetrically on each end, though I dial those into taste as well. You can also get some cool sounds if you boost 2K and start playing with each individual band. Do take advantage of that for some more contemporary tones later on, but this is a good starting point. And this very much does the Tube Screamer thing, but you get a different texture out of it. And since this is a graphic EQ rather than parametric, each frequency band is going to have a little ripple in the frequency response, which I think is kind of cool. Gives a more individualistic nature, and it's kind of more akin to changing pickups more than just having a regular high pass and low pass affair. So I think it kind of works for this application in that way. What you'll notice, though, is that I'm clipping the inputs and outputs as the red LEDs are flashing constantly through most of these demos, even though I am running it on 18 volts, which is another drawback of using this older version. But I kind of like that because you get a little bit of op-amp distortion in there, and it's very subtle. You can't really hear its contributions. But between that and the stack up of the transistor distortion, just like with the Rat, you kind of get this blend that sounds almost more tubey as a result. So I think this is a great pairing and an obvious shoe-in for today's tones. For the next pedal, I chose yet another graphic EQ. Don't worry, I'm not that senile yet. I didn't forget about this one. This one has a different role entirely. This is going to be placed in the amp's effects loop, and we'll be sculpting frequencies after the preamp and after the tone stack. So this is kind of acting as our machete, our 80 for 20 to get most of the frequency response dialed in. And this one is kind of our scalpel to really go after specific bands. And the reason I chose this one for the effects loop today is this 800 hertz slider. That's very much that dime bag and thrash metal scoop the mids kind of frequency. You know, it's like 725-ish hertz on a Mark Series amp. You scoop that out, you're already on a pretty good path to getting that thrash metal sound. And as you can see, I'm not taking it to -15. This is usually in the -12 to 8 range, because a lot of the times I either have this dialed below noon, or even for a lot of it, I'm going to push the mids really high on this amplifier. That configuration kind of acts as a blank slate, as the more mids you push on a passive tone stack like this, actually the flatter the output frequency response becomes, and can really help you get fundamentally different sounds out of the same sort of distortion engine, if you will. Now, you're more than welcome to flip the two, or put 2 of these in the front and 2 of these in the effects loop, whatever you want to do. But for the frequency bands I was going after today, this just kind of worked. The final pedal selection for the day is my tried and true Boss DD7 digital delay. If I had to pick one wet sound for basically any rig, it's probably going to be a delay, because you can dial it in to be a little like a reverb, or if you have a fast enough delay time, you can actually make it sort of chorusy sounding. But we're going to be using this to replicate the sort of studio digital delays that were very much in vogue when a lot of these thrash records came out. And yeah, we could use the analog or modulated sounds on here, and that would be cool as well. But just the standard 200 to 800 milliseconds is all I'm going for here. You can kind of have a dotted 8th note with the tap tempo. And though this pedal, again, was not available back in the day, the DD2 and DD3 was, and they were going to sound very similar to this given its digital architecture. You can use this in several ways for a thrash application. I'll either have this always on as kind of the studio background slapback effect you can hear on some albums like Kill 'Em All, but also as a solo effect. And with that one, I'm probably going to have the delay time be a little longer, a little more present in the mix, and of course, being able to disengage it when you go to your rhythm sound. Before we wrap up today's Tone Engineer, I want to show a couple more contemporary use cases where I'm using a different scale length guitar, higher output pickups, and I think it sounds fantastic on all of these demonstrations, but especially here, I think it goes to show how much untapped potential, how much we've left on the table with this series of amps, and especially its tube-based big brother. I would love to hear these more prevalently in today's music. Yes, it doesn't have the gobs of gain that something like a 5153 does, but if you're going to be using outboard pedals and EQ and stuff anyway, this is really capable. And honestly, I find the distortion texture and the way that it sounds just to be more interesting just because it's different. Yeah, it has a little bit of that boxy nature to it in some ways, but I kind of miss that tone. Now, wouldn't want this used exclusively, of course, but I'd like to hear more sounds like this. And if you're someone that can scrape something together like this for relatively cheap and you still want an out loud in the room, you know, make your pants shake when you're playing guitar kind of rig, this isn't a bad avenue to go. These things are getting more expensive, but again, if you can put this all together for less than the cost of a tube head, I think you'll have just as much fun. And that's going to do it, my friends, for today's video. I have a lot more in the pipeline for other vintage solid-state style amplifiers like this, so do stay tuned for that. Any other questions or comments, please leave them down below. As always, we'll see you next time. Bye.